So what I want to do with you here today is, I think we're all products of our history and our environment. So I need to talk to you a little bit about GE. I've spent 25 years, the vast majority of my career working there, and it shapes the way I look at things in a very profound way, as you would expect. So I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about that, even to the point of talking a little bit about my own role and how I function there. I want to talk to you a little bit about the global environment from a healthcare perspective and how that might inform us if we're starting to think about questions related to cost and value of technology innovation. Maybe give you 3 observations and then some takeaways at the end. So, make sure I got this going right. So, just to start on GE, first of all, I think innovation and imagination is a fundamental piece of our corporate culture. The company was started by Edison, so, and I think his spirit is very much alive in the company today. I love Edison. One of my favorite quotes of his is, all you need to invent is a good imagination and a pile of junk. So I think that kind of spirit still is very much alive in our company. But I think there's another important aspect to that. GE was one of the original companies listed on the Dow Jones Industrial Average in 1896, and it is the only company that is still listed there out of the original companies. So I think what that really demonstrates is a capacity to innovate, turn that into wealth, and continue to do that over a very, very long period of time. We have about 290,000 employees globally, revenues of about $150 billion. This is kind of the structure of the business today. We like to think about country in a box. If you look at that product portfolio, it solves a lot of the big infrastructure problems that countries have, certainly from the perspective of the footprint that we have across the energy portfolio, right from oil and gas down through water and power, nuclear energy, very, very strong portfolio. Big portfolio in technology infrastructure, of which healthcare is a large piece, but then so again is aviation and transportation. And largest financial institution in the world is not a bank, so a lot of the financial wherewithal to take some big global infrastructure projects and be the capital arm that helps developing countries kind of execute on those. So an interesting kind of corporate framework. Healthcare itself is, about a $17 billion business providing transformational solutions in healthcare across a very broad range of applications. It has about 53,000 employees worldwide. We invest well north of $1 billion annually in R&D. The business itself is headquartered in the UK. This is the first GE business that has ever been headquartered outside of the US. And I think that's a really, really good thing, because I think it gives us a very different view of the world to be centered in Europe. Again, we'll just move on from that. There is one thing I want to talk about here just a little bit before maybe I close off on this slide, and that is healthcare in Canada. So we're about a $400 billion business in Canada. We have about 650 employees. And I thought it might be interesting for you to know how I see my role in the company. I currently breaking in kind of a new manager, and I had a discussion with him a little while ago, and I said, look, my contract with you is to do 2 things. First of all, we'll be operationally bulletproof. From orders and sales down through the P&L to op margin, we'll tell you what we're going to do at the start of the quarter, and we'll do that. That's your ticket to play, I think, in a big company. I'm sure Neil would agree with me. But the second thing I really need to wrestle with is in a large global business, and really representing a country that is incredibly cool but small from a population perspective, is how do you retain mind share in a big company like that? Because clearly I'm not going to be able to do that on volume. And my second commitment is to be the conduit of innovation. That person who is very receptive to seeing innovation in the Canadian environment and providing the conduit up to the product portfolios and the product businesses to be able to take advantage of it. And that person who is looking in the product portfolios for emerging technologies that we can bring down into Canada, innovate around the application of those technologies, and then scale them for global development. So I think that's a really important piece to kind of get across to you, because it is a piece of my job that I take very, very seriously. My Capacity to do that is made much easier by the company that I work for. Healthy imagination is the strategy of the healthcare business. You know, there are 4 big platforms that kind of support healthy imagination. The first one is innovation, commitment to develop over 100 high technology, low cost devices over the next 6 years by 2015. Partnership, there are funds in here. Big company like GE, still not big enough to be able to solve all the problems of healthcare. Our capacity to do that will be defined by the partnerships that we're able to create with healthcare providers and like-minded corporate partners in that kind of initiative. Employee focus. You need to remember we spend $3 billion annually in the provision of healthcare for our employees. So there's some very, very strong programs here to help us try and slow that burn rate in a profound way. And the final piece is really around advocacy and corporate citizenship. But the piece that's maybe most relevant here is really around the innovation agenda on this. And it's really in terms of how we approach all of our product invention and innovation, is to really drive that towards a 15% improvement on what I think are probably the 3 resonating global themes in healthcare, and they're related to cost, quality, and access. So I want to start to frame now this whole question about value and cost. You know, let's just stand back and look at the world a little bit today. The world is a profoundly more volatile place than the world that most of us grew up in. Profoundly more volatile. I don't think that's a good thing. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it just is. And I think if you get your head around that, you know, if you consider the financial meltdown of 2008, there were people and companies that made a lot of money in 2008. So, you know, this volatility, it's a condition. It's not a limiter, but it's something that you need to get your head around. I think the other big thing that we see in the world today is a world struggling to deal with its inherent inequity and variability in a lot of things that we experience socially. And there are many, many current examples. You can't pick up the paper today without seeing many examples of that. So, you know, I think around these 2 kind of global themes that we would see related to volatility and variability, you've got some pretty profound impacts that we're starting to see in healthcare, because healthcare is actually a component that, you know, sees expression of those 2 global themes. So there's 4 things I really wanted to talk about in terms of healthcare themes that I think, again, are important when you're thinking about this whole question of value and cost. And the first one is, you know, we all know there's some very strong resonating trends in healthcare today. But the fundamental challenge is the global economic unsustainability of the delivery of healthcare in the world today. Every jurisdiction in the world is dealing with this. So when you think about that from the perspective of value and cost, I find it odd sometimes that from an innovation perspective, we always want to gravitate to those things that are higher cost. Not that they can't provide great value, but to me it's like going to the plate and already giving up your first strike, right? Going to the plate with only 2 strikes instead of having 3 available to you. So that's the first one. The second one is, I think we need to think very seriously about access. There are 2 billion people on the planet who have limited or marginalized access to healthcare. 2 billion people. And I think that's a really, really powerful point to think about from an innovation perspective. So if you're thinking about that access issue, and it's a profound issue globally, are the devices that are going to solve that problem big, expensive devices? Or are they smaller, smarter, ubiquitous, low-cost devices? Third point is really the mobile connected world. I think we're on the brink of a really interesting trend here, right? You know, we talk about our healthcare delivery system as being physician-centric and what we're trying to do around that. The other interesting aspect of this is that we're hospital-centric, right? The context, the paradigm, has always been about the patient going to the hospital. Well, I think because we live in a world that is becoming increasingly more mobile and increasingly connected, we're on the brink of a point in time in healthcare when we now think about how do we take the hospital to the patient, right? And again, you want to think from the value and cost perspective, just as starting points and thresholds in those 2 points. What are the technologies that are really going to drive a solution to that? And the fourth point is really a point around how we think about the world, how we think about globalization. So, you know, globalization is not a new theme, but I think until very recently, last few years, most people have thought about globalization as developing big, sexy, capable products in a developed market, very, very high end, very high cost. And then when we think about the developing world, we think about, so how do I defeature that and maybe take some cost out and try and make that applicable in those markets? And I could give you a list as long as your arm of the failures in every industry that have been incurred with that kind of thinking. Recently, I think we've all been exposed to the concept of reverse innovation or globalization. And I have a very good example of that. When we were the corporate partners for the Olympics and the Paralympics last year, we made a global product announcement regarding an electrocardiogram machine called the MAC 800. We did that at the Paralympics. It's an interesting device because historically, an electrocardiogram machine is a pretty big box and about a $60,000 or $70,000 investment for anybody who wants to purchase one. And it was a real barrier in terms of our ability to drive that technology into the India and China markets. So the India and China team actually took that device and they developed an electrocardiogram machine that was really tiny, had a brilliant, very, very simple kind of interface, and could be sold for a few $1,000s. So the reverse innovation piece of this is the developed market teams now looked at this new technology that has been developed in India and China and said, you know what? With a couple of features, if we could add them to that device, we could take them and start to exploit some new markets. So again, for developed markets, taking innovation that was occurring in India and China, adding some features and some capability to it to make it resonate locally, opening up new markets with it. So, you know, and I think that's very much a trend of how companies think about this whole innovation world today. So, if you take this back to value and cost, and I certainly will not try and replicate Dr. Martin's, you know, tremendous definition of how you look at that, but, you know, certainly I think we all get the fundamentals here, that from a healthcare economic perspective, right, you need to be able to deliver clinical results that are financially measurable as being distinctly superior to what you're replacing. I think we all get that. But depending on where you are in the world, these thresholds, it's not a simple equation about value and cost, because no matter where you go, the relationship between those two things changes, and they change in very, very profound ways. And I think it's very important for us to keep that in mind, because I think we have too much, way too much of a predisposition to think about the Canadian market and to think about developed markets. And we don't think enough about the emerging markets in the world. So let me try and pull this back today. I'm sorry if I've been long-winded, but just kind of pull it back to 3 points that I want to talk about. Be local, but be local with a view to global impact, how you take that innovation and scale it up for global markets. Fill a need, don't create a new one. And the third point is bigger is not always better. So just in terms of being local with global impact, I think there's some really good examples here. We sell x-ray machines into Africa. And that's very problematic because I've heard stories about, you know, x-ray machines that just use conventional power. You plug them into the wall, and there's not a plug when they get to site. In some cases, there's not even a wall in the way that we would think about a wall. And if there are places where there is power, the power fluctuations are so profound that you can't really deliver reliable performance of the device to the user. So the team in Africa actually worked with partners to incorporate solar panels into what they sold to be able to stabilize the power situation. And this, to me, is a really good example of that localization aspect, being able to deliver tremendous value through that. You know, the one that I think is a real profound one for Canada to think about is about how we deliver healthcare in remote communities. You know, if you think about the Canadian economy and what is driving the Canadian economy, so much of it is related to our commodities base, our strength in energy. We have #2 oil reserves in the world, one of the leading mining nations in the world. We are the center of foreign investment. Canada is #1 for foreign investment in mining. So there's going to be a tremendous amount of development here, most of it in places where we don't have people, right, in the far north. So if you want to start putting people into those areas, you're going to need to deploy infrastructure. And if you're going to need to be able to deploy infrastructure, healthcare is a fundamental piece of any community that you would think about establishing. And we're doing this at a time when we already have a shortage of doctors. So how are we going to do that? I mean, I think there is capacity here for innovation in the Canadian environment that can absolutely be the canary in the coal mine for the rest of the world. Because once we solve that challenge, that solves a lot of fundamental problems in developing markets like India, like China, and it also solves it in countries that would have the same kind of issue from an energy and mining perspective like Russia does, or Australia. So tremendous capacity to be able to scale and go global as a result of that. The next point I really want to be able to touch on with you is another Canadian example. And I'll try and do this briefly because I think John Salonica talked a little bit about this morning, but really related to the investment that we've made in a pathology center of excellence here in Toronto. The reason we did that is, I think there's three big reasons. I've talked a lot about the economy. I can tell you GE loves kind of the fundamentals of the Canadian economy and sees this as a great growth market where we want to come in and invest. So that's an important point. I think the second point here is the role the government is prepared to take in terms of helping to drive an innovation agenda. And I think that's true, certainly if you're talking about at the federal level, and it's true if you're speaking at the provincial level. Tremendous support from the Ontario government. They've made big investments here. And then the third component is really the collaboration framework that I think specifically we have here in Ontario. We have some of the best scientists in the world here. We have a collaborative nature and disposition that I think is really quite unique when you start to compare other jurisdictions globally. So really what drove this for us was the focus on, first of all, a big public policy challenge. You may remember 2008, 2009, it was difficult to pick up the paper without hearing about pathology tragedies that were occurring in New Brunswick, in Newfoundland. The night Minister Flaherty announced the $50 billion deficit in the midst of the financial crisis, the pathology issue in Quebec was big enough to knock that story off the lead of the national news. So these were big, big public policy issues, and we always look for that alignment of public policy to product portfolio and really try and drive that. So that's a good situation for us because we like to think we're a pretty good engineering and technology company, and it gave us tremendous capacity to try and provide value. The second piece that we found when we started looking specifically in Ontario was this really great open collaboratory model. Great clinical expertise that we connected with in downtown Toronto, but in the Ontario Institute for Cancer Research, in Canada Health Infoway, and in SimTech, the latest CECR successful applicant, really found just a tremendous collaboratory that we could connect to very directly. And then finally found a great partnering vehicle in MRI Life Sciences in Health Technology Exchange. And I know John Salonica spoke to you about that this morning. So the result is really our first global center for the development of pathology innovation. And we really hope in taking some basic technology to bring it into that center in a strong clinical environment and really learn and innovate in the application of that technology, not with a view to just doing it in Canada, but giving ourselves a real head start, because I think Canada is an early adopter in this technology. And it gives us a big head start in terms of how we approach the global market with really innovative solutions in healthcare systems that are very much like ours, public healthcare systems. And we believe that knowledge will be directly transferable. This center is looked at as a global best practice within GE, and we're already exploring other ways that we can really add more flesh to the bone of this pathology center in some very, very innovative ways. So, you know, the tie-out really to cost and value here is that I think it's a really good example of developing innovation at a local level. If you can align yourself with early adopters, as long as you have that vision to really leverage that Canadian knowledge for global innovation and global exploitation. So, fill a need, don't create one. The point I'm really making here is fill a healthcare economic need, don't create a healthcare economic problem. And I think the big example that I would have here relates to what I think is probably one of the most profound challenges we have in terms of provision of healthcare in this country, and that's related to the aging. So growth in our seniors population accounts for half of the total population growth in the next 4 decades. It's a pretty staggering number. 2/3 of the people who have ever lived to the age of 65 are on the planet today. In 2001, there were 4 million people in Canada over the age of 65. By 2041, there will be over 9 million people. In 1950, there were 2,000 centenarians on the planet. Today, there are over 5,000 in Canada alone. So these are very, very staggering numbers. And I think, you know, with people living longer, this is not just the concern about how people continue to live with dignity at home and manage a disease. It's managing the comorbidities, the concurrent conditions that you have of many disease processes going on. And the other piece I think we need to bear in mind here is the human cost of this, because there's a very profound human dimension. So I want to give you some quotes here. It is estimated that the annual cost for fall-related injuries in seniors over the age of 65 is approximately $2.8 billion. Falls cause more than 90% of all hip fractures in seniors, and 20% of those who are hospitalized are dead within a year. Pretty staggering. And this is from the CADIF environmental scan. During hospitalization, the elderly patient often experiences reduced mobility and activity levels. Functional decline, including changes in physical status and mobility, has been identified as the leading complication of hospitalization for the elderly. The hazards of bed rest during hospitalization are well established and include immobility, accelerated bone loss, dehydration, malnutrition, delirium, sensory deprivation, isolation, shearing forces on the skin, and incontinence. So this is a big challenge. I mean, this is a huge economic challenge. I think it's maybe the biggest component of how we bring some economic sustainability to our healthcare system. Now, what is it going to take to solve an issue like that? Well, you know, for sure, it's going to take a lot of coordination of care providers along the continuum. We're going to need technology to help them be able to do that. It's going to take some significant e-health integration, I think, to get all of the data that you can collect on these people into their electronic patient records. And I think there's a significant opportunity here for data mining of that information from a patient safety and quality perspective to build feedback loops so we improve the nature of care. But profoundly, there's going to be a suite of devices and technology that is going to be applied to this problem that is really going to enable a more coordinated and integrated care delivery process for us. And, you know, really when you think about it, I think we have tremendous white space in this country to be able to do that innovation. And because I think we have the public policy alignment for that and really innovate with a position to, you know, really take advantage of global markets because it's a big global issue. Sorry, I went through that slide without flipping it on. Now the final piece, let me say this, bigger is not always better. And I'm very satisfied because I've said that without any attempt at low humor involved in that statement. So, so look at this picture. I mean, so if I'm a guy working in the mines in Fort McMurray and I'm driving across the frozen tundra at 2 o'clock on a February morning in order to make my shift, that Hummer looks pretty good. But if I'm a Parisian paying 2.5 times what we pay here for gas, and I'm trying to find a parking space in Saint-Germain-des-Prés, I'm taking that smart car, right? And it's that whole question about, is bigger better? Well, it's very dependent, right? It's very dependent on conditions, and it's very dependent on where you are. So I wanted to talk to you about 2 developments that I thought were, just very, very good examples of why bigger is not always better. And the first one is really this product. It's a product called vScan. Oh, by the way, I just happen to have one with me. So it's not really a gratuitous plug, although I've been accused of being gratuitous before, and it doesn't scare me. It's really a means. It's really a means just to show you how portable these technologies can be. Now, this is not the same device that you would get in a hospital diagnostic imaging department. It doesn't have the same kind of resolution, and it's not certainly at this stage going to obviate the need for that. But in the physical exam of a patient, someone presents to you in an emerge department, they've got a big abrasion over their ribs and their abdomen, they're in pain, and you're looking at it and you're querying, is there a bleed there? Well, you could send them to the diagnostic imaging department for, another higher cost test, or the physician could put this probe down on the individual. The resolution is not fabulous, right, by comparison with a high-end diagnostic device, but it's good enough to be able to see blood pooling, right? And that's the information that you're looking for. And it gives you that capacity to look inside the body. It's an $8,000 device versus a $170,000 full-blown ultrasound machine. So, I think, and by the way, just another interesting story. Do you know how this kind of came about? Our chief technology officer pulled out his iPhone and an ultrasound probe from a conventional machine and a roll of duct tape. And he duct taped it together, took a picture of it, and emailed it to one of the development teams. And 3 months later, it turned up on his desk. That turned up on his desk. It's kind of an interesting story. So, and actually as an employee, I love that we can still do that instead of in the very, kind of very rigorous and meticulous way that we normally bring products to market. The next one is really a very local kind of example. And it's a system called ENITS. So since the end of June 2010, 140 acute care hospitals have access to the Emergency Neurosurgery Image Transfer System. That's what ENITS is an acronym for. It's a project launched by eHealth Ontario. It enables emergency physicians to provide CT images digitally to an on-call neurosurgeon for assessment when a patient presents with head trauma. By eHealth's count, the implementation of this system has already saved about $50 million. Now, that development, which we actually did here in London, and we have deployed globally, was a very low six-figure custom development for the people here in London, right? When they were looking at a system that was going to cost them millions of dollars, some guys on our team kind of looked at it and went, geez, I think I know how to do this in a lot less expensive way. We're able to innovate, and that product now, that capability that we've deployed here, is now being deployed across Canada, and it's being positioned globally. So I think it's just another great example that, those solutions sometimes that provide the greatest economic benefit are not the big developments. They're very, very cost effective. And I think it's a great thing for us to bear in mind as we consider questions of this nature. So one of my former bosses always used to say to me, so what? So I figure I better leave you with some so whats. First of all, I think bigger isn't always better. And I would just reiterate this point that I think bigger starts with more strikes against it than smaller, smarter. So, there are, and, you may be sitting out there going, geez, I thought this guy was from GE, right? They do all kinds of big developments and things like that. I'm very conscious of that. There is a place, I think, for bigger approaches and big investments in new technologies, but more and more, I think, our company certainly, and I think we all need to be conscious of it as well, is turning more towards these smaller, smarter, more cost-effective technologies that have much greater kind of global impact. The link between innovation and commercialization can never be forgotten. I love this quote, if the system won't buy it, it's just an invention, right? It's not an innovation. So I hope I'm not alone in thinking that the $42 billion we spend in this province for the provision of healthcare should maybe get us more than just the provision of good health care. I don't think it's unreasonable to expect that we should get some commercialization impact, that we should get some job creation and some padding of the corporate tax base through what we do from our innovation agenda here. So I think that link is a really important one to remember. Public policy. I just think this is the most powerful lens to bring to any discussion on innovation. It's just a phenomenal indicator for the appetite for a solution, and I think will inform any question related to cost and value, and the tolerances involved in that question that may not be illuminated in any other way. The fourth point is really to work in much more of a collaborative model, and I feel the reason for this is that there is nothing more complicated than healthcare. There are many, many stakeholders. There are many varying agendas. We deal with the whole issue of government here. Again, they bring their own agenda and their own perspective to things, and I think really having tremendous external focus and building those collaborative bridges is vitally important to a successful innovation exercise. And then the final point that I would say here is really just about getting your head up above the dividers. You know, we look too much just inside this country. It's so liberating to go and look at the world as opposed to just looking at the country. You know, at a point in time when our foreign trade is expanding just phenomenally into new parts of the world, India, China, we have picked up 8 points in foreign trade balance in the last 5 years, right? And that's a trend that's going to continue. You can't ignore what's going on in the rest of the world because it just creates so many interesting questions and new problems for us to be able to turn all the creative minds that we have in this country towards. So those are my remarks, and I'd like to thank you for your attention.